Swanson. My call sign is WO7Y. We're going to be using a slide deck that's been put together by another amateur radio operator, teacher, whatnot, that lives down in Utah Valley, named Noji Ratzloff, who makes this content available, and I've had a good experience using it through the years. So during this course, we're going to try to acquaint you with the ins and outs. We're going to talk about how ham radio works, not just demonstrating it, but also talking about like what radio waves are and how that translates to us being able to use our radios to communicate different distances, long distance and short distance. And then to prepare you for the test. We're not going to cover everything that's absolutely on the test. I'm going to try to give you a lot of information about so I'm going to try to give you, kind of broad strokes around all the different kind of sections of that are covered by the test. And those really kind of come down to what you need to do to work with ham radio, the person behind the radio. The science behind it, and we're not going to get deep down. There is some math, but it's just like multiplication and division. Very simple. And some understanding of units and whatnot. So we'll talk about some of the science behind it. We'll learn a couple of those equations. And like I said, we're not going to cover everything, but we're going to try to give broad strokes to each area so that you can study more, and you'll have the context with which to learn about what's on the test, or prepare yourself for the test. And then the exam, we'll be offering an exam here as part of the city, with the city, but the technician exam is offered weekly somewhere here along the Wasatch Front and farther away. There's lots of different groups that offer the exam, and it's the same if you take it no matter where. But for studying for that exam, between the class lecture and answering your questions here, or through email or text or call, there's also some really good resources for you to learn. And one of those is here at Ham Study. And this is a website done by somebody else in Utah Valley. And it's hamstudy.org. You can get a free account here. This is not the only way to, the only app or website that can teach you that can help you learn about ham radio, but it's a really good one that also just happens to be locally supported. And you go there, you create if you create an account there, it'll allow you to kind of save your progress and allow you to see what questions that you've seen before, what questions you've gotten right, what questions you've gotten wrong. So just start with, as it says here, click on technician, then go to the study mode, and it'll kind of just show you all the questions in kind of sort of like a flashcard. So it's got kind of two modes. There's a study mode and a test mode. In the study mode, it'll show it to you as like a flashcard, and then you can click on a corner of it and it'll show you some crowdsourced explanation for the right answer. And you can kind of go through the whole thing that way. And you can also just go through it in test mode and just see the questions, and it'll pick them randomly for you. We'll talk a little bit more a bit later about the structure of the test, and how it's laid out and whatnot. But this will kind of get you started. So I'll send you an email, but a couple days after this class, kind of reminding you to go look at Ham Study and study specific sections of the question pool. Okay, so one of the reasons why people are really interested in ham radio is that in any large-scale disaster, communication is the first casualty. You know, I can tell you that, you know, so growing up in Northern California, there was one mid-autumn day that I came home and turned on the TV to watch the World Series when I was in high school, to see the A's and the Giants play. And before that game started, thought I heard my mom calling me from the other side of the house. Started walking over that way, and all of a sudden, the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. Just shaking the house crazily for what seemed minutes and hours, but really it was only like, you know, 10, 15 seconds. And just a number of aftershocks. And some of the effects of that, now granted, this is back in 89, no cell phones then, but you know, some of the problems that caused, whether it be like gas, you know, rupturing gas mains or collapsing freeways or other things like that. But one of those things was, you know, it impacted the phone system pretty severely. So for you know, several days, it was hard to get a call out of the Bay Area or call into the Bay Area. And some sections of the Bay Area, you know, some cities and whatnot had like their whole phone lines down and whatnot. And there were a number of people with ham radio that helped support some of the rescue efforts and whatnot, you know, and helped with communications during that time period. Flash forward to today, you don't have as many landlines, but all of us seem to have these cell phones. And some of the same problems can occur with communications. Like, we rely on our cell phones so much, not just for calling people, but also for information over connection to the internet, texting to our family members and friends. And those cell towers, like the one just down the street that looks like a water tower,
yeah,
a ginormous water tower that isn't a water tower, or those crazy looking like cell phones that try to look like palm trees and conifers and stuff. But they got a couple weaknesses. One, they can only handle so many connections at a time. So if in an emergency, a lot of people are trying to call out and can use up, you know, kind of all those connections, the bandwidth those towers can handle. The other issue is if they aren't receiving power after a day or two, they may run out of their batteries and whatnot and no longer be functioning. So amateur radio is one of these, is a technology that can kind of step in there. It's not as versatile as all those as cell phone use, but it can allow you the ability to communicate independent of the current infrastructure. Go ahead.
Got a question. It's really interesting. There's a movie out, it's just recent, it was with Julia Roberts. It's called Leave the World Behind, and it has to do with a electromagnetic pulse. This knocks out the satellites, the cell systems, knocks out the power grid. Everything's gone, you know, and they lose contact with everything. And all these planes are coming down, you know, and it's just interesting. And I don't know if amateur radio is impacted by electromagnetic pulse or not.
We'll come back to that, but the short answer of it is, it depends. So if you have, like, in your emergency supplies or whatnot, and you take your radio, take a radio, like a cheap radio like this one or whatever, and say protect it in one of those Mylar envelopes or something that gives it kind of a Faraday cage,
right,
kind of thing that can shield it. Because essentially an electromagnetic pulse will take anything that has a transistor. And if you look in this room, there's a whole bunch of things that have transistors, even the stupid lights now, right? That rely on transistors, and what happens with the transistor is that the pulse will actually like overwhelm it and blow it.
Yeah, okay.
But if you protect some of your electronic devices, such as amateur radio equipment, then you know you should still have that capability. So yeah, so we talked about like kind of ham radio, but here's some of the communication solutions that we've got. So cell phone, CB radio, which is kind of had a surge kind of in the 70s and early 80s, and ham radio. So CB radio is something that takes up a very specific set of bandwidth. Ham radio also takes specific set of bandwidth, but has a lot more allocations from signals or from bandwidth, part of the spectrum that can communicate around the world to parts of the spectrum that can provide TV locally, or even internet locally if necessary. You've got walkie-talkies like FRS and GMRS radios, and social media on your laptop or your cell phone. You've got broadcast AM, FM, shortwave radio. Who knows what shortwave radio is? Anybody familiar with that?
I used to have a shortwave radio.
Yeah, that's one of the, like, so when I talked about there's being certain like parts of the spectrum that are good for long range communication, governments and things like the BBC used to actually broadcast over some of those frequencies, and that was called shortwave radio. So like you'd have an AM FM radio in your car, you could get a radio with a little bit longer of an antenna and whatnot, and try to listen to like foreign stations. Newspapers, satellite phones, satellite internet, which I guess is getting more with the SpaceX stuff, is getting more available, but still is pretty rare. All the way down to here in Bluffdale, you got smoke signals are shouting, but you could also have like your side by side or your horse help you to ferry messages from place to place, right? But a lot of those ones have, like I said, there's, like with cell phones, you've got issues with broadcast AM, FM. That's great to get some messages from the outside world, but it doesn't help you get your messages out. This is kind of where ham radio is kind of, amateur radio, ham radio is kind of the most, one of the more versatile. It's just a meme I saw somewhere. Just to kind of give you an idea of just kind of the power that's available to you. Like, so cell phone like this is running on about 1/10 of a watt. Because we've got so many cell towers everywhere, it doesn't need to be very powerful. But at the same time, when you get away from the cell towers, your reception and your signal goes to crap. But then you bring in GMRS radios and CB radios, it gets a little bit better. But still, amateur radio operators, not that this can do 1500 watts, which is like the power of your microwave at home. Something like this can only do 5 or so, but you can get radios that can go all the way up to 1500 watts and have a range that gets you not just, across the valley, but worldwide, depending on the frequencies and radios that you're using. So, we talked about this. Easy to use, lightweight, but does have disadvantages. You need to have a tower in sight. Really low power, like I said, 1/10 of a watt. The battery power, they tend to, there's the battery power that your phone can handle, or there's other limitations. Like a lot of things these days, we rely on data, and without data, it kind of seems like we're useless. But what is ham radio? And you've heard me kind of say ham radio, amateur radio, kind of interchangeably, purposely. No one's quite sure where the name ham radio came from, but it is a nickname for amateur radio. And amateur radio has been around since the beginning of radio, since Marconi. That there have been people that have been experimenting and building their own radios, or adapting commercial technologies to amateur use, or creating new technologies that later get adopted and become used commercially. This has been happening for the last, 125 years or so of amateur radio. But that's not sure why, but they'll call it ham radio, and sometimes call the operators hams. So some things about amateur radio. So what makes this different than listening to KSL? Well, first of all, it's not broadcast. You're not, it's not one way in the sense of like, you're just trying to transmit your message to as many people as you can and not worried about communicating with them. It's not commercial. You can't advertise anything on it. You can't put anything on it that are for pecuniary interest, or like basically financial or monetary interest. Its whole purpose, the reason why the FCC has created it, or has preserved sections of the spectrum, the very valuable spectrum that they're able to auction off to cell phone companies and other people right and left for millions and billions of dollars. Why they protected some of this is a few things. One, they're trying to advance radio skills among a portion of the population, and a good portion of that is for emergency preparedness. It's proven in a number of disasters that amateur radio operators have been an asset during large-scale disasters. There's no monetary interest except for incidental to classroom instruction, or like you can advertise your own radio for sale. Like you can tell people that you're selling your own radio equipment, but yeah, it's kind of, but not as like a business. And formally it's called the Amateur Radio Service. And let's see. So what do we use it for? We talked about emergency preparedness, but there's also a lot of aspects of it being a hobby. And that kind of varies from, some of those are, some people will use it, as part of their emergency plan. Some people use it just for their outdoor recreation. For example, if they're gonna go do a lot of backpacking or trekking or whatnot, ham radio is a good way to stay communicating with both outside world for emergencies, or between parts of your own party, hiking party or backpacking party. It's good for that. But also there's some other things that like there's contests where people are trying to connect to, converse with people throughout the world, or throughout, like whatever the kind of limits of each band are. Communicate like with a radio like this, how many counties can I connect to? How many different, like they've chopped up the state into grid squares. How many different parts of the state can I communicate with? And they'll have like certificates and things like that, or they'll have special contests over a weekend or whatever to see who gets the most things. There's also just people that, kind of like that Pokemon thing, you've got to collect them all. Some people just are trying to connect to as many places as they can, and that's kind of a goal for them, is to, hey, can I communicate with somebody in each of the different countries of Europe, or something like that. And there's some other kind of technical challenge parts to the hobby. Like I said, building things with electronics and then using them, doing crazy things like communicating with somebody by bouncing your signals off of the moon or off of a meteor shower or something. It's possible that you can talk to somebody across the United States during like the Perseid meteor shower or something, by both of you aiming your antennas in the right direction, and get a signal back and forth. We'll talk about why things like that are possible. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with amateur radio. It's not just for emergencies only. So why? First of all, it's greater range than regular walkie-talkies. If I get an FRS radio, those typically all have like fixed antennas, and frankly, these little fixed antennas are crap. They're another reason why your cell phone doesn't. Do you guys remember the first cell phones? If you remember some of the first cell phones, they actually had antennas. I mean, there's an antenna here, but it's built into the case now, but it's not a very good antenna. Like I said, there's only about 1/10 of a watt of power and a crappy antenna because they just assume that you're gonna be somewhere in line of sight of a cell tower. Ham radio has a lot greater variety. As you notice, like greater range, some of that is the power. Some of it is just the ability to use different antennas. So this radio right here originally had an antenna more like this, which is, it's not just that it's short that makes it less effective, but the longer antenna that's closer to what's resonant for the frequencies that this operates on, make it both receive and transmit better. It's less expensive than a satellite phone. There's no like monthly subscription fee. I don't know if you've all seen for satellite phone subscription fees and things like that, but they haven't been cheap. Maybe they'll come down now with Starlink over time, but Iridium phones were not that, or were not cost effective, and like, and you're like limited by the number of characters. You might get one of these avalanche things, you know, if you do a lot of backcountry trekking and stuff, but like they'll charge you by the character, and it's not very affordable. And it's more reliable than cell phones if the power goes out. Sure, you still have to charge up these, but you can also get packs where you can just use normal batteries with some of these radios. They don't have to, doesn't always have to be like with a USB charger. But what are the catches? So, ham radio requires a license. It's regulated by the FCC. There's a $35 licensing cost for processing your license. So there's a $35 cost for processing your license, in addition to like the $15 test fee. But that $50 is essentially all the fees, and you'd only pay that $35 every 10 years, or if you like make a major change. But like address changes aren't major changes. But the one requirement that they have now is that you keep your email address current, and then try to keep your other. But if you at least keep your email address current, that's the kind of the key requirement. But it does require passing a test. Now, what is the test? The test is a 35 question, multiple choice question test, which you have to get at least 26 correct answers on out of that 35. It's not timed, but the limitation is how long your test proctors are willing to hang around for you to complete the test. But it's 35 questions, 35 multiple choice questions. And it has to be taken under certain conditions. There's ways to take it online, involve like having like a webcam showing that you're not cheating on anything. But there's also plenty of places that offer it. Like when it says testing center, they don't mean like you have to go to like one of those professional testing centers. We'll turn this room into a testing center on the 3rd when we do the test. But it's got to be proctored. There's a lot of study aids available, and you don't need to retest to renew your license. As long as you don't let your license expire and like expire by a couple of years, there's no reason to, you don't need to retest. And they really don't want, they're not trying to make the technician test, the first entry level test, they're not trying to make it too hard for you to pass. It's not bone dead stupid, but with a reasonable amount of study, they're not trying to make it like overly detailed and whatnot. Now, when I say there's 35 multiple choice questions, there's actually a public pool of questions. You can see all the questions, and actually, some of these guidebooks these test books that I have, and I'll pass these around. Just page through that and pass. These are some books that you can get. I'm not saying you need to get them, but ones like this one, just go through every question and give you the answer and an explanation. But that has every question in it. But the way they do it is, because they want to make sure that the test covers a broad variety of categories, and covers each of those categories, there's actually like 35 separate question pools of anywhere between 5 to 15 questions. And this has created a test question pool of about 450 to 500 questions total. But they're focused in pools. So you'll only get like each area, like one that might talk about different frequencies, which would be, oh, that's a memorization question that might be tough. Well, there's like 5 other questions in that pool, and you may or may not get one that talks about remembering a specific frequency or a specific number. So like I said, there's 26 correct answers required. So you can kind of focus your study on those areas that you're strongest, and then kind of build out until you at least have mastery over kind of those 26 of those 35 areas. Actually, 10 areas total, subdivided into a number of sub areas that add up to 35 different areas, sub areas. And if you pass, then you'll be given a call sign. You're assigned a unique call sign, and you can't transmit unless your name unless your name and call sign appear in the FCC's online database. The Uniform License something, or ULS database, that you can see at the FCC's website. And that'll have information about, your name, your call sign, your class of license, and the public information that you share with the government, as well as what you say it's okay for them to post. And it'll also have information about when you got your license and when your license will expire. Now, if your license expires, you shouldn't transmit with it until you've processed the renewal and the renewal appears there as well. Any questions on the stuff that we've covered so far? Go ahead.
So once you have a call sign, so any other people who has a call sign can contact you?
Well, so it all depends on you and them being on the same frequency at the same time. So it's not like a phone where you would call somebody with your phone and they would get well, there are some ways to do it that way, but for basic use, it's more about being on the same frequency with your radio at the same time they are, and then you can talk to them.
So it could be by chance I could predetermine the frequency
Yeah.
you can test.
Yeah, so for example, earlier, before you came, Ken mentioned that we have here in Bluffdale, we do what's called a net every Sunday night at 8 p.m. And what that means is basically that we have a ordered check-in. So controlled, like people listen in on their radios at a certain frequency, in this case to a certain repeater, and we'll learn more about repeaters later, at a certain time. So if like at 8 p.m., from like 8 to 8:15 p.m., or earlier if it goes quicker, and people all listen in on that all across Bluffdale and some of the surrounding communities, listen in at that time, and then check in, and then we give out announcements or have discussion or whatnot, during that time period amongst all those things. So predetermined time, predetermined frequency. So call sign formats. So once you get that call sign, it's gonna be in one of these valid call sign formats. Okay, so you're already familiar with some call signs. What are some of the TV stations and radio stations, if you even listen to or watch TV anymore, or listen to the radio or watch TV anymore, and don't just do streaming all the time? What are some of the call signs you can remember? KUTV,
KTVX,
KTVX,
KTVX, and then there's KSLs.
yeah, KSL. So you see that you're familiar with ones like, that are like 3 or 4 characters long, and they start with K. What are some other ones that you've heard of that start with something else?
NPR.
Well, NPR is the name of a network, somewhat.
W,
W,
G, it's out of Chicago.
WGN, yeah. And I'm sure, I think there's like a WABC or W, you know,
Yeah.
there's like a whole bunch of ones, but why K, why W? Why do some, and what's significant about ones that start with W versus ones that start with K? Do you guys know?
Is it a frequency thing?
No, it's a geographic thing for it. What's the geographic, what determines what, where are all these, like you said, where was that W in?
Chicago.
Chicago. And KSL is here, KGO in San Francisco,
So west.
west of the Mississippi and east of the Mississippi.
So west is K.
Mhm.
Is that on the test?
No,
Okay.
but I'm just trying to relate something that you've all been exposed to. So, but now when we bring that back into amateur radio. So with amateur radio, K and W don't matter for that same way geographically. Actually, there are call signs that start with K and call signs that start with W here in Utah and in New York and whatnot. But what's significant is that all US call signs either start with a K, an N, a W, or an A. That's not specifically on the test, but these formats are. So with amateur radio call signs, you'll get this, notice it says like a 2x3 or a 2x2. Well, or 1x3, what they're referring to there is that the call sign has 2 letters, the X, the by, the X is a number, and then 3 letters. 2 letters, 1 number, 3 letters. There's always in a call sign, and this goes across the world, because there's different allocations of these K and WA. There's different ones for different countries. Some countries like the Philippines use D, or there's other ones. Like each country has its own little prefix allocation, but there always will be only 1 number that sits somewhere in the middle of that call sign. So we kind of classify them as 2x3, and that's kind of the most common in the US, the entry-level call sign. So my first call sign, and they actually assign these serially by geography when you get your license. So that number is significant when they grant you your license. So when I got my license in California, my license was a 2x3 that was KG6 GOP. And that was purely gotten by the next person that sat next to me in that test probably got KG6 GOQ. They just roll through that Like,
And then as you got a higher licensing, it went to a 2x2? How it works?
actually, yes and no. So when you get your further licenses, they have different, I think, Ken, what's the format for a general?
I think you go down one, you can do the 2x2.
I think it's like a 2x1 or a 2x2. It's like,
Yeah, I think it's
2x2.
2x2. I just chose to keep mine.
Yeah, so you get the choice. So if you go on to do the general, so if you get your technician and then you go on to pass the general test, you can choose to keep your previous call sign or take the next one, the next serial call sign in your class, which I think would be in the 2x2, and it's gonna be something like something 7, since you live in Utah, and 7 is the Utah one, we're part of region 7 in the United States for this. And then if you were to go on and get your extra, you have that option again to keep or get the next serial one.
So if you come in contact with somebody with a 1x3, you kind of know,
Mhm.
oh, they're
Yeah,
higher than a general or whatever.
yeah. And then, the other thing, and we'll talk about this, is we'll get into this a little bit later, is there's vanity call signs, so you can actually go and request things in this format. They have to be in the format,
Yeah,
and they have to be not held by somebody.
it could be like initials or something.
Right, so for example, mine is a vanity call sign, it doesn't have any significance other than it's short.
Mhm.
And we'll get to that. But you've got these formats, you've got this 2x2, this 1x3, this 2x1, and and then the 1x1. Although the 1x1 is reserved specifically for special events, like it's a temporary call sign, just allocated for some sort of like a special radio contest or something like that. So with that, the question is, are these legal call signs? So quick review. So this one, W0 RPD,
1x3.
yep, is that
Yes.
legal?
Yes.
Okay. How about this one?
Yes.
Okay, how about this one?
No.
Nope, because there's no 3x2 available. Okay, this one? Okay. How about this one?
No.
Right, exactly, 2 numbers, good, bad. This one? Yep. And this one.
So you said these aren't legal, but are you?
All of them are
you
legal except for those 2.
Are you suggesting maybe that some people will have call signs, but they're not legal?
No, it's just, well, that would be one way to determine somebody that shouldn't be on the air.
Yeah,
If
they
they,
don't really know what they're doing,
yeah, exactly, if they're making up a call sign, you know,
yeah.
that's one big clue that they're not licensed. And that's one of the key things there is, so your license gives you the privilege of broadcasting on specific bands of the spectrum. And to do that, you have to have a legal call sign, and you have to state that call sign at, periodically as you transmit. And that's station identification. You've gotta identify yourself every 10 minutes and at the end of your communication. So you get on, you don't have to immediately identify yourself, although people typically will identify themselves when they get on the radio. But you don't have to do it immediately. You just have to do it within 10 minutes and every 10 minutes. Now, have you noticed this on the radio, on like FM radio or AM radio? Periodically, each of those stations every 10 minutes identifies himself. On TV, if you were watching a broadcast TV station, they at least are putting like, you know, KSL at some point overlaid somewhere on the screen periodically. Because that's what they need to do to comply with the law. So like even when like a radio station does like a pre-recorded stuff, they have to record the station identification within that. But you as an amateur radio operator, you need to identify yourself every 10 minutes. You've got to end your communication with your call sign. You can't use somebody else's call sign. Although you can allow somebody that you are supervising to transmit with your call sign. We'll get into that later. But you can transmit in any language you want, but you've got to use English for your identification. And on phone, so meaning on any sort of voice communication, you can either say your call sign, or some people even have radios that will overlay like Morse code, or even a pre-recorded thing in the background that will play. So for example, the Bluffdale Club here, in concert with the National Guard base at Camp Williams, maintains a repeater somewhere up on one of those peaks. Camp Williams Peak or something, right?
Williams Peak, yeah.
And that repeater, we use that repeater on our Sunday nets that I talked about. But every 10 minutes, it'll lock us out from saying anything because it needs to get out its station identification. So like, it'll stop repeating what we have to say to it and just transmit transmit a voice, a pre-recorded voice saying this is whatever what's the call sign for that repeater? I don't know, we just ignore it because we're always paying attention to.
I think they screwed it up. If you look online, it's mine, but it's supposed to be the club's.
Yeah.
7G something.
Yeah. So the key things there are every 10 minutes, English only, and by voice or by CW. Morse code is what CW means. So continuous wave is what CW stands for. But you know CW is Morse code. Okay, so talked a little bit about this, but getting on the air. So you pick a frequency that's within the bands that your radio will work on, and you'll learn later. We'll talk a bit later about band plans and things like that allow you to know what frequencies to pick. You listen on the frequency to see if there's anybody talking there. You listen some more. Listen to the conversations that are there or what, and then proceed to speak at a time that's convenient for you to break into that conversation. It's fairly like real life. And some of this is just not being a jerk on the air, is the way one of Ken and I's former colleagues would call it. But what to say first? So if you were just looking to connect and see, like, so there's a few frequencies, specific frequencies, and we'll talk about some of these later, that are specific to like, one's called the national calling frequency. And so it's a place for people to kind of, it's sort of like one frequency that you can always count on somebody listening to, or most likely that if somebody's listening, they'll likely be listening to it. And you go to that frequency, and what would you say first? Well, one thing you could do is using some of this kind of old Morse code lingo, is the CQ, which stands for calling any station. So you might get on the air and go CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Whiskey Oscar 7 Yankee, or WO7Y, and then wait to see if anybody, responds. And then, talk to them or whatnot, or if you're, but you could also be saying, so if you had somebody specific that like you mentioned, having some, like a friend or somebody like that also has their radio, so maybe they're waiting there. You get on and you say, KF7CLY, this is WO7Y. And that would be me calling Ken. And if he's listening, then he would come back and say, WO7Y, I'm here, hey, or whatever, and then we could proceed to have conversation. Remembering to discussing whatever it is that we need to discuss or want to discuss. Just remembering that every 10 minutes we've got to, and at the end of our conversation, we have to sign out with our call signs. You might announce that you're listening to a repeater. So this is also kind of helpful. You might go WO7Y listening, or WO7Y mobile, meaning I'm in my car. Or I could go WO7Y testing. One of the things with a lot of repeaters, why it's also useful, is that the repeaters will acknowledge that they've heard many repeaters will acknowledge you. And they'll do that with kind of like a beep or a static right after you transmit that you'll be able to hear on your radio. Any questions on that? On kind of communicating? Basics of communicating on the radio? Things like CQ, that's something that might be on a test. And saying your call sign. Not appropriate that you wouldn't necessarily call CQ on a repeater. That's apparently a question now. So, let's see. Some more things. So there's a couple other type of call signs that we'll talk about. Tactical call signs. So here in Bluffdale, as I mentioned, we do the shakeout. We do a shakeout drill every year, and we will sometimes substitute our call signs for tactical call signs. So like over at City Hall, what do we call it now? The ECC, is it the ECC or the E?
It's ECC.
Yeah.
We've always been ECC, but they changed.
There's just some different FEMA and certain things, but we'll call that the ECC, as a tactical, the Emergency Communications Center. We may call this, what have we been calling this fire station?
Just Area B.
Yeah, Area B. So when we've run like a satellite ECC here, we call it Area B, or we might like designate so we might have, so in Bluffdale, we've got like about 30 different sections for CERT, for example. And those that have like when we're doing emergency communications drills, we might just start referring to that. We'll take the check-in from the persons in section 3 by their call sign, but then we might start referring to them as section 3. And that's called a tactical call sign. You might use tactical call signs at events. So a lot of amateur radio operators help out with things like the Wasatch 100 race, or some of these long distance races, or other events or parades. And you might designate certain call signs for certain waypoints or certain parts of a course for a parade or for a race. There's vanity call signs. So as I mentioned earlier, you can find any section of this, so all the valid call signs for the United States, you can look through all those valid call signs, possible call signs, and if it's not taken, and you like it for whatever reasons, you can pay a fee and get it as a vanity call sign, sort of like you would get a vanity plate at the DMV. If for example, there's places that you can look up online and you can see, oh, these call signs are available. These ones are for expired licenses, and then there's like a 2-year grace period if the person doesn't renew their license within 2 years. Maybe they passed away or they just have forgotten about amateur radio. After 2 years, that call sign becomes available again, and you can request it, which is how I got mine. I just wanted one that was shorter, that was the 4-character long, the 2x1, and I found a couple that were expiring about the time that I wanted it, and put in my first, second, and third choices, and got one of those. Although there are limitations, like a technician can only apply to certain patterns. A general has a wider variety of patterns that they have available to them, and an extra has all the patterns available to them. One thing that helps you, and you've kind of heard me say this when I've said my own call sign, is to learn the phonetic alphabet. It helps clarify your call sign when others are hearing it. It makes it so that they don't make mistakes or whatever in understanding that. So, and that's, we'll get at that in a few minutes, see what that phonetic, basically you can use any phonetic system you want. There is kind of a generally accepted phonetic system that we'll cover in a few minutes. Now, what to do with an emergency on your radio. So I said earlier, you know, hey, when you're going and you want to communicate with other people, go find this frequency that they're on and listen some more, and then break in when it works for that conversation, not to be rude. In an emergency, you don't care about that so much. You do want to wait for a break. Or you can try, you're more successful waiting for a break because of the way that some, especially FM, works, which is what most of these handheld radios use. But you break in with something like emergency, followed by your call sign, or break, followed by your call sign. Priority, you know, same kind of thing. And if other people hear these, then they should stop their if you are a listener and you hear that, you should stop your conversation and kind of acknowledge them and see what their message is. And try to render assistance if you can. During a true emergency, you can basically use any means available to save life or property. Let's see. And if you are using that, when it says like kind of don't transmit unless directed to do so, so like if you're as part of a net or something else that's a ordered and controlled conversation on the air, then you might want to, then you would wait until the net control, the person that's running the net, gives you permission to speak after the emergency's been taken care of. So we talked about things like KSL and stuff. As an amateur radio operator, you are the radio station. Just you walking around with this thing, you are a radio station. I mean, we think of kind of radio stations as kind of, you know, somewhere a studio and somewhere a big, huge antenna that's like 10 stories high on top of a mountain or something. But with amateur radio, sure, you could have a big antenna at your house and a radio. You and that radio and that system are a station, but your call sign is not, you're a radio station with a call sign. You're not tied to a specific frequency. You're not tied to a specific location. And there's rules that you need to follow, and obviously respect and courtesy, no foul language or you know, no music. Although the odd exception of, there's an amateur radio station on the International Space Station, and if you're communicating with them and they happen to be playing music in the background and you record that and retransmit it, that's fine. But so you hearing them play Major Tom on the radio while they're talking to you is fine, but yet you playing Major Tom on your radio for everyone else is not. And that's part of it, it's not broadcast, it's not, you don't have the rights to that or whatever, but apparently people in space, they can get away with this, I don't know, that's the rule. And must not be broadcast, meaning not for the general public. Any questions about that?
Sorry, what must not be broadcast?
You must not be just broadcasting to, like,
Oh,
it's,
General.
it's, right, yeah.
without any, just a broad, hey, I set up a little show for myself kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things where like people have done recorded show or recorded news things for amateur radio news. But I think that's kind of in a gray area. You're not, and you're definitely not broadcasting to people without amateur radio licenses. So you'd never be using a frequency that's not allocated just to amateur radio. And the frequencies that we're allowed to broadcast on aren't the ones that you would be able to listen to in your car. Any other questions on that? Okay, some quick best practices. So first of all, and this seems kind of weird, because we don't necessarily think about this, but the most effective way to use the microphone on your radio is not to speak right into it, it's actually to speak across it. That's a way to kind of not overpower the mic in it. On amateur radio, like, one of the key things is, as I mentioned, our former colleague would always say, not being a jerk. So, you know, always try to keep the conversation positive. Admit to, if you make a mistake in how you transmit, or, you know, what you're doing, what you say, or like with your equipment, admit it. Own up to your mistakes when you realize you made a mistake. If somebody says there's an issue, look first at yourself to see if you're the one that's causing the problem. Before you start, you know, blaming others for causing interference or whatnot. Try to keep things civil. Don't necessarily try to, you know, don't be that person that's always correcting other people. Avoid bodily noises and things like that. We're not shock jocks, so. But any questions on that? Okay, so now the phonetic alphabet. So this is the most, really you could use any phonetic alphabet you want, as long as it's easily understood by others. You could say A is for Andy. You know, we all, you know, all have to like go on and like spell our names or whatever to our banks or whatever when we talk to them on the phone. But this is kind of this is the accepted, it's not necessarily exactly the military one, is it?
It's pretty darn close, yeah.
But it's pretty close.
Spelling's a little different, but it's close.
Yeah.
But this is one you'll hear the most. So like when I give my call sign, I've made it a habit of saying Whiskey Oscar 7 Yankee, using this. It's almost harder for me to spell it out W07Y, because I've gotten myself so used to just saying Whiskey Oscar 7 Yankee, which is the great thing about having a short call sign. But yeah, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, Juliet, Kilo, Lima, Mike, November, Oscar, Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, Tango, Uniform, Victor, Whiskey, X-Ray, Yankee, Zulu. Okay, so your quiz is, in your head, spell out your name with the phonetic alphabet. Take a moment to do that. And the phonetic alphabet itself is not on the test. But the fact that it exists is, as kind of a uniform way to spell things. So, the author of this deck, Noji, he would go by November Oscar Juliet India. Okay, so then we got some definitions. used some of these, but some of them might be new to you. Okay, on the air, this is probably familiar to you, but you're transmitting. Mode, that's one that's gonna be a little bit new to you. Mode is is like kind of the signal format that you're using. Mode could be something like voice or phone. It could be FM voice, meaning voice using frequency modulation. It could be AM voice, voice using amplitude modulation. It could be data, CW for Morse code. We use the word phone for voice communication. CW, as I mentioned earlier, for Morse code. Data transmissions we would call data, or digital transmissions we call data, and that just means anything where it's not analog, right? So where we're turning things into numbers and transmitting them somehow, whether that be through Morse code, whether that be through radio packet, or some of these there's a bunch of other formats that take either our voice or specific like text data and turn it into radio waves and transmit that and get received. Your ID, another way to talk about your call sign. Broadcast, meaning you're trying to transmit to the general public. And lastly, RF, meaning radio frequency of all types. Key ones here, CW is International Morse Code. RF stands for radio frequency signals. Those are the ones that kind of appear on the test somewhere.
What was the first one again you said?
CW. And once again, that stands for continuous wave because you're turning on and off a continuous wave or a continuous tone. But we just refer to it as Morse code. Okay, so here are some of those modes that we talked about, or that we alluded to. We'll get into some of the details of these later, but right now you just kind of need to know that some of these exist and that they are valid modes, okay? So phone and voice, so phone or voice modes. There's FM voice, there's AM voice or phone. And then there's something called SSB, and that stands for single sideband. And that's where they take AM and FM, or AM, and split it. So, who can tell, does anybody know what AM is? Like what I mean when I say AM?
I know, enunciation mode, it's.
It's amplitude,
Yeah,
amplitude modulation.
modulation.
So, how many of you have ever watched like a crime drama, or they'll show like a voice print analysis, and they'll show like the squiggly, they'll show like a squiggly of what the voice looks like on an oscilloscope or something, right? Well, this is just a wave. Radio goes in, radio and sound both use waves. And so one of those characteristics of a wave is its amplitude. Amplitude is that, kind of the height. And then like in between here is the frequency when I look at this waveform, okay? So in amplitude modulation, I'm basically, when I speak into a mic, and this is really kind of the basic stuff, like, how many of you have ever had a record player? Or ever like seen or used a record player? How many of you have ever taken a pin, attached a cone of paper to it, spun the record on its thing, and just attached that little pin on there and heard the noise? You ever done that when you were a kid or anything? but, cause basically all a record player in it, in those grooves, the grooves kind of go up and down like this in a microscopic level in that groove. And so when the pin goes here, the needle comes in here and rides on these, it's creating, as it goes over those bumps in that groove that spiral into the center, it's modulating the amplitude and making sound. We call that analog sound. Does that make sense to you all?
Yep.
That idea that like, as we do this at a certain frequency and certain amplitudes, it can make, it captures or replays the sound that we make. So we can see this if you plug a microphone into a oscilloscope and see it, or you can see this sometimes on your MP3 playing application or something, and it'll show you the how the sound is being modulated. So the most basic thing, so AM radio in your car and on amateur radio, the AM uses the same technology. It's the most basic way to get sound, to replicate sound over the airwaves. SSB, and therefore LSB and USB, are a subset of amplitude modulation. So in SSB, they decide, well, most of the time this is pretty close to a mirror. Like if I just cut off half of this, and duplicate it and just mirror it over, I actually get a pretty good representation of it. It's not perfect, but I get a pretty good copy of what I'm hearing, and it takes up less bandwidth. It doesn't take up as much of the airwaves to transmit. So they've got something in the radio that basically will split it as you speak it, take off half of it. It takes off, it keeps like a center portion and the peaks, and then erases either the top or the bottom, the lower part or the upper part. So AM starts as AM, they have it, and if I take off the top, it becomes lower sideband because I left the lower part of it. If I take off the bottom, it becomes upper sideband. And there's certain bands where one type or the other, lower sideband or upper sideband, is preferred. But all it's basically doing is using a filter to take off part of it, and then on the other side, when it gets received over the radio, the software or the circuits in the radio basically are reduplicating it out, so then it looks like a full waveform again. Not 100% fidelity, but good enough. Which is also why, what's the difference when you listen to an AM radio station versus an FM radio station, which one has better fidelity? Which one sounds better? FM. Just because of the nature of how it's transmitted. There's less things in there to interfere with that. You guys have any questions on this? We're gonna come back to this kind of mode stuff later. But really this is what's going on so SSB, so single sideband, and then if you take off the top of that AM, so single sideband is a form of AM, and if you take off the top, it becomes lower sideband, and if you take off the bottom, it becomes upper sideband, because of what's left over after you filter it. Questions on that, or need me to explain that another way? Or am I just confusing everything? Okay. The next types that we've got a bunch of digital types. We already talked about CW Morse code, but there's a bunch of other types of digital. So packet is a form of radio communication similar to what our cell phones are using, or the basis of kind of early cell phone communication when it went digital. It kind of looks a lot like the internet, right? Of where little bits of data are where a message is kind of pieced up into little pieces and then transmitted and looking for acknowledgement. And if that acknowledgement comes, then it transmits the next packet. If it doesn't get that acknowledgement, it retransmits the first packet and does that until it can get the message through to the other side completely acknowledged. RTTY, that's for radio teletype. You guys have probably seen teletype phones or something at some places for like use by the blind or the deaf, depending on the situation. There's like Braille phones and whatnot that use a form of teletype. For the deaf, it will like put spell it out over the screen. That's just a form of that goes over the radio. JT65, FT8, and DMR. So JT65 and FT8, you don't need to know what they are, except for that they're forms of digital communication. But what they are is really a method of communicating over really long distances that don't have really good reception side to side, with a lot of error checking and whatnot. Doesn't transmit that much. Like you might transmit a sentence or two per minute. And what way that it does it is like it transmits it really a number of times over a minute with lots of error checking, sort of like the packet. And then it becomes the other side's turn to transmit back over the next minute. So there's like time slicing involved with a lot of error checking or a lot of error checking and verification to get your message, small short messages over great distances with both JT65 and FT8. DMR is basically digital voice radio with a little bit of data. It's what you use. It's what a lot of our a form of DMR is what's being used by our police and fire now. Where you used to be able to like listen to everything on a scanner that you might buy at Radio Shack, which is now dead. But you used to be able to like buy one of these Bearcat scanners or something and listen to everything because nothing was encoded. They use forms of DMR now to have both, to use digital so they can transmit some data along with the voice, and also to have encrypted communications to do that. But it's basically a form of digital-based voice and text. It's used mostly on FM radios and whatnot. Okay, questions on these different modes?
So the digital and data modes aren't used really with ham radio.
No, they are.
They are.
But it's let's put it this way, the top level of amateur radio, I mean the most exposed, the widely used form of amateur radio is with an analog FM.
The phone voice.
Yeah, analog FM. There's a lot of people, then as you get into the hobby more, some people go and start doing a lot of these things with digital forms. Like I would like to experiment more with JT65 and FT8.
So you can go farther.
Yeah, as part of that kind of, hey, let's see if how many different far places can I
Yeah.
connect to.
Okay.
This radio, for example, does both analog and a form of DMR, not specifically DMR, but a form of digital radio that allows me to speak voice over to other people that have a digitally enabled radio, but it'll also transmit my call sign at the same time, or it could even transmit my location. I wanted to encode that with it. But it just gets into how far. But the kind of the most accessible part of the hobby is FM with an FM walkie-talkie. Yes. Any more questions? So the statement that might appear on the test. So FT8. Here's the statements. We already got the statement about CW. FT8 is a digital mode capable of operating in low signal to noise conditions that transmits on 15-second intervals. So it's kind of time sliced and tries to, it's useful when you're trying to transmit on really poor conditions. It does so much like air checking, like resends the same thing a bunch of times in several different formats, and then gives the other side a chance to receive that, process it, and then send their response. And you kind of literally are waiting on sections of the clock for when you do that. DMR is a technique for time multiplexing two digital voice signals on a single 12.5 kilohertz repeater channel. Yeah. The key thing there is digital voice. DMR is digital voice. Do you remember those two things, that phrase? When you see this, if you see this question, you'll get it right. Okay. The ITU. So what are some of the organizations that control radio across the world? Well, the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is one of the organizations under the auspice of the UN. That basically all the countries come together and make some international rules and regulations around how the electromagnetic spectrum should be used across the world. So like TV, satellite TV, radio, like broadcast radio, as well as like forms of point-to-point radio, all fit into some of these regulations. The FCC rules fit within the ITU rules. Now the ITU divides the world into 3 different regions. We're in region 2, the red one here. And then Europe and Asia, Europe and Russia and Africa and the Middle East kind of fit into region 1, and then there's kind of an Asia to Pacific that covers region 3. And so there's kind of subgroups that kind of manage things. So what this means is, kind of for us is like, so for example, license classes. So like we'll get into, they manage rules about amateur radio. So for certain, they'd say, okay, the following, they come to an agreement and say, let's allocate the following frequency ranges for amateur radio for international communication. And then we'll say, let's allocate the next couple of frequencies for maritime, like for use by shipping. And this section used by militaries or whatever. And then, so they make some broad stroke plan of who should be using what sections of the electromagnetic spectrum, leaving a good portion of, especially the stuff in VHF and above, which we'll get to what that means later. But the higher the frequency, the more control of it a nation has, because those aren't very long distance frequencies. One of these things that they regulate is like, okay, you need to have people know a certain amount to use some of these lower frequencies that can go talk on worldwide bands. They've made some level of requirements at the ITU level that then the FCC has implemented in what they call the general and amateur extra licenses. So the technician license gives you, which is what we're studying for here, gives you access to all amateur radio bands from 50 megahertz and above. 50 megahertz and above, which corresponds roughly to the beginning of what's called VHF, or very high frequency, going up into ultra high frequency, UHF, going up into, all the way up into microwave, and above. Till you get to, and we'll talk about the spectrum later in more detail, and you'll kind of see what I mean by that. But the technician license, and the reason for that is why those are entry level is one, they don't go very far distance wise. So like at 6 meter band, which is 50 megahertz, you know, you can get maybe 100 miles or something, or under certain like certain like atmospheric, ionospheric weather, which we'll get into later, you can like make it farther, because you're able to bounce things off of the ionosphere of the Earth and get a little bit farther. But for the most part, because most of these frequencies go straight out the ionosphere of the Earth, or die like when they hit the mountain, like, because they're all considered from 50 megahertz and above, they're considered mostly line of sight frequencies. They're all governed just by national laws. So like the FCC does almost all the regulations there, and technician is the entry level license that covers that. There's a couple, like technician also gives a couple little tiny spots where if you have the right equipment, you can do a little bit of transmitting on some of the international frequencies, but not much. Then general, which would be the next step, which is also another 35 question test, that, you know, takes you into a little bit more depth on understanding how radios work and how radio propagation works, because that's what's the keys to being successful on communicating on those worldwide bands. Amateur Extra, which is the license that I have, basically allows you access to all the frequencies that are amateur radio allowed. Questions on the license classes? So these are the only license classes that you can take a test for now.
Got a question on
Go ahead.
the radios that are available. They have, do they also follow the classes of licensing, or do they have full bandwidth for all frequencies?
For the most part, there's a couple answers to that. Yes, and so the FCC licenses radios for sale in the United States, based on them being limited to the frequencies that are allotted them. So like FRS radios, walkie-talkies that you go buy at Cabela's for hunting or for hiking, or GMRS. That's the FRS and GMRS are kind of related FM radio types. Those radios, not only are they limited to specific frequencies, but they're like have fixed antennas. I can't go and I can't like take off the antenna and replace it with a different one on those. They are basically certified as is, and only for use as is. Amateur radios similarly, but we have a lot more kind of discretion around it. They are limited to they're limited to transmitting only on the frequencies for which they're designed. So for example, this radio that does some digital and some analog, like digital voice and analog voice phone. It works on 2 different bands, covers both of those whole bands, but will also allow me to listen to other bands using those same technologies, but I can't transmit on them. This Chinese radio is supposed to be doing the same thing, but also is hackable so that you could transmit, say, on FRS frequencies if you wanted to. You could listen on FRS, but you could also probably program it to to transmit on FRS. Illegally, but you would still be transmitting on FRS. Does that kind of answer that? But at the same time, there's enough, the problem with radio communications is there's no one size fits all. You're kind of like I have a radio that will actually transmit on, I've got a console radio that will transmit on some of the lower frequencies all the way up to 70 centimeter band like this one will. But it will go to some of the lower ones. But it also costs over $1,000 because it's got to handle each of those sections
Right.
because of the different electronics that are involved. And not only that, but I can't just hook it up to any antenna and have it transmit on all those. I have to have an antenna that's going to be resonant to be an effective transmitter. So, and when I say resonant, it means like when I said like 70 centimeter, like this one, so this one will transmit on the 2 meter band and the 70 centimeter band. Meaning that the wavelength, so the distance between one wave and another, and we'll get onto that later, is 70 centimeters, right? Yeah, something around there, and 2 meters for each of those. And to be an effective transmitter, not only does this radio have to make up the signal coming out right here to be proper for that frequency, my antenna that's connecting to it also needs to be somewhat resonant for it to actually be effective and not and get off, transmit effectively. So this one works better than this one, even though these two radios cover the same thing, and these two antennas roughly have the same, or work on the same bands. This one works better because it's longer.
Right.
And actually, it's not just that it's longer, it's that it's a specific fraction of that 2 meter wavelength. That for whatever reason, mathematically or scientifically in physics,
Right.
works.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have to have, if you're acquiring a radio, do you have to have, do you have to have a license in order to purchase it? Do they request a license, or you can,
Nope.
you can go out and buy it and do whatever you wanna do until you get caught for?
Until you get caught and fined $50,000, yeah. Depends on who you piss off when you're transmitting, I guess.
Right.
But there's a guy down in northern Utah County that's been involved in a lot of the first responder education, like up here at the community college and stuff. But one of his hobbies is hobbies within radio is called fox hunting, and it's not hunting of the animals, foxes, but it's a form of direction finding, where you go hide a transmitter somewhere, and you try to find it. And the practical application of that is finding somebody that's either maliciously or negligently transmitting.
Right.
So, questions on these license classes? So yeah, you don't need to prove that you're licensed to buy a radio, but that's just the fire department going off to
Ambulance 91 and Ambulance 92 respond to head injury at 2076 West Aspen Avenue. Respond on Beck Fire 4 near 14,805 South. Medic Engine 92, Ambulance 91, and Ambulance 92.
Okay. So those are the 3 license classes. This may appear on the test that these are the license classes. But then there are also 3 former license classes for which people may still have and can legally transmit. One of those is called the novice, and the novice was created kind of as a way was the original entry level and gave really limited access to some of those long distance bands, mostly on Morse code, and some access to the ones that the technician have. The Tech Plus basically was the technician, as it is now, plus some more spots on the lower one if you passed a Morse code test, which they no longer give out. You no longer have to learn Morse code for any of the levels of amateur radio. And the advanced was something in between general and extra, based on like, you answered more questions and you passed a higher level, word per minute level of your Morse code. All you need to know is that these are classes that existed, but you can no longer get a valid license for. If you already have one, you can continue using it and renewing it, but you can't actually get one for the first time now. Okay. We can call it, let's just do 2 more slides, and then we'll call it. Okay, I mentioned earlier, you can have somebody else transmit if you're supervising them using your call sign, but you should never use somebody else's call sign without them being there and without their permission. So this is the idea of a control operator. So the control operator is the person at the controls of the radio. The licensee isn't necessarily the control operator, but the licensee, the licensed person, needs to at least be supervising them. So the licensee can designate an operator, but both of them are responsible for proper operation. So the licensee, if I'm licensed and I let my unlicensed daughter transmit for me, I'm gonna have to make sure that she properly does things like give the call sign at the proper intervals, and not, do all those things that we said were bad to do on the radio. But both of us are responsible for proper operation. And you can't transmit without a control operator, I guess. So, kind of the statements from the test questions. The FCC assumes the station licensee is the control operator unless station records indicate otherwise. So you can keep a log and keep track of some of these things, if that's something that you want to do, especially if you're going to allow other people to transmit on your station. And that's not just for a licensee and an unlicensed person. It could be like, for example, Ken has a general license and I have an extra license. If Ken and I were sitting at something like Field Day, for example, which is an annual day that amateur radio operators around the world, especially the United States, try to get on and have there's a contest to see who can, which clubs can contact the most people. But say I'm sitting there with Ken and we're transmitting on an extra frequency, he can be the control operator, and he can use my license to transmit on those extra amateur extra sections of the bands. The station licensee designates the control operator. That's another statement from a question. The control operator and the station licensee are equally responsible for the proper operation of the station. And an amateur station must not transmit without a control operator. Those are some of the kind of statements that kind of put together this thing. So what are the different types of control beyond like this control operator thing that I'm talking about and licensing? Well, there's local control. So if I'm here with the walkie-talkie with this HT, me transmitting on that is local control. If I have this right here, this mobile setup, hooked up to the antennas that are on this building and start transmitting, it's local control. However, if I use something like the internet, or if I have my radio set up that I can use touch tones to get it to change to do things if I'm using another radio to control it, that would be an example of remote control. So I'm away from the radio, but I can actively control it. And then lastly, automatic control. You basically program the radio what to do, you're away from it, and it does what you want it to do. A repeater is an example of automatic control. So go stick this radio transmitter receiver up on top of a hilltop with an antenna and a solar panel and a battery pack, and it listens on one frequency and repeats that on another frequency. How it does that, you've programmed it, but you don't have to be there for it to do it. It just does it until it breaks, and you have to go up to that hilltop in the middle of winter and fix it. Okay, you got a question?
Just, does it need to be stated what you're doing? If you're remote?
No, this is just, if you were keeping a logbook, actually you wouldn't even do this so much for logbooks, but it's just, it's for understanding what rules are at play for how you do things. So like, there's something called the name of the regulations that govern amateur radio, and this will appear in some of the questions, not necessarily as the answer, but in some, it'll appear in the question for context. It's called Part 97. And so there are specific rules for local control, remote control, and automatic control.
You don't necessarily have to say, with my call sign, I'm remote
No.
controlling. Okay.
No. So look, operating a station over the internet is an example of remote control, as defined in Part 97. And repeaters are a good example of automatic control. Those are kind of the questions that come from this. Okay, so we've made it through about a third of the material. This is kind of the less technical third. And the next time, we're gonna talk a little bit more about interference and parts of a radio, the different parts of a radio station, and probably in the time after that, we're gonna get into a little bit more technical, where we'll talk about basic electronics, and as well as kind of basic radio propagation, and kind of understanding how radios work, and then how radios transmit, and the basics of that. With that, you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I mean, if there's, is there a need to purchase a book or
No.
anything, a reference book? Everything that we have would be on that hamstudy.org.
Yeah, and this all comes down to your learning style. Some people do better with a book in hand. Those two books that I passed around are very different. One is like question by question. It groups the questions into thematic areas, and it's just question by question and answer and explanation.
Okay.
The other one is more thematic, like, hey, let's talk about electronics, and talks about a bunch of things in there, and then has references to, oh, this is this question, this is that question. Hamstudy.org and some of the other things are really good as far as exposing you to the questions, drilling you. It's a great way to kind of drill yourself on the questions. Like I said, all the questions that will be on the exam are public.
Right.
You don't have open book when you take the test. But all the questions, if you want to, you can have studied every single question before you take the test.
Exactly the same question, they don't even change the wording.
They won't change the wording, they'll change the order of the answers. So you can't remember that, oh, this one is B.
Right.
But they'll move the answers A, B, C, and D in different order. But the question will appear exactly the same wording.
Yeah.
And each of those will appear each answer will appear with exactly the same wording, just in a different order. But yeah, hamcity.org is a great place if the flashcard method kind of works for you. There's also, you can go to YouTube and you can find, whether it be sessions that we've done or sessions that, other people have done explaining various things that appear on this test.
But does this
Tons of
tamstudy.org to provide the narrative so you're able to learn the concepts, or are they just drilling you on the questions?
The crowdsourced answers on the virtual back of the flashcard
All right.
vary in quality, but try to give you that
I
explanation.
see. Okay.
But yeah, like I said, these aren't the only books that are available. There's other books that you can find at Amazon, Kindle books and whatnot, if you want to, if that works best for you. I know that there's one book that is essentially like the wording of all the questions and their right answers, but put in a narrative format.
Sure.
So you like read through all the statements somehow.
Right.
But there's a lot of different ways that people have presented it.
Right.
Other questions? Do you have one? Okay. Anything else? So, we will meet again. I hope to see you guys here next time. If you came in late, there's somewhere is a clipboard with